Hey, y'all. Sorry I'm a little bit late. How's it going?
Hi, I'm doing good.
Good,
Doing
Mike.
pretty good.
Hey, Jacob. Nice to see you. Sorry I'm a little bit late. Mason, greetings. Christian, greetings. Jacob Levels, hello. Let's see here. Mirka, nice to see you. David Newsom, excellent. Y'all, the two people I was hoping to talk to, I don't see. So I'll just have to wait for them. I was hoping to talk to Malia and also Max/Charles. All right, they're not here, so we'll just keep going. Greetings, everyone. Did y'all see the so just FYI, I think you probably know by now that we're using the same Zoom link over and over again. Also, what I do is in terms of the lecture notes, what I do is I just update the same document and then repost it on Canvas, if that makes sense. So if you were to pull up the lecture notebook right now, which I encourage you to do, although I'm going to pull it up in a moment, you'll see that it's the same as previous classes, except I've added to it. All right. So that's how I do that. Does that make sense? Do y'all have any questions about that? All right, cool. Why don't I go ahead and pull that up then? But then actually before that, why don't I pull up the reading schedule? First, let me share my desktop with you guys. There we go. Can y'all see my desktop?
Yes.
All right, cool. All right. Let's look at the reading schedule real quick. You can see that I've added several names for presentations. We have two presentations later this week on Wednesday. Two presentations on Wednesday. There's the reading schedule. So we're going to, so on Wednesday, I was hoping that Christian and Mirka could present. Does that sound good, you guys? Kristen and Mirka?
Yeah, it's good by me.
Awesome. Christian, does that work for you? I think Christian's here, right?
Yes, I'm here. I didn't realize I had hit unmute.
No worries.
I'm like, yes, it works. But yeah, cool. I was just muted.
Well, we'll plan on doing that at the beginning of class. And I really look forward to that. Today, what we're going to do is move. We're going to shift toward Augustine. Yeah. All right. Does that sound good? We're going to watch a little video. It's slightly embarrassing, and maybe one or two of you have seen it. I can't quite remember. It's a video that I recorded a couple of years ago about St. Augustine's Confessions. But before we do that, let me pull up the lecture notebook. There we go. Can you guys see that? Cool. I'm going to make this go away. We had a good discussion about Plato's line. We had a good discussion about Aristotle and Heraclitus and Parmenides. We're going to see that stuff come up over and over again. And now we are going to start with the confessions. Before we do that, y'all, let me just ask, Is there anyone who has not been scheduled to present other than Malia and Max / Charles, who are not here? Is there anyone else? Everyone who can hear me right now, y'all know when you're presenting and who you're presenting on?
Yes.
Excellent. Before we delve into the confessions, does anyone have any questions, any thoughts, anything that you'd like to share with the class? I think things are going pretty well so far. I mean, we need to be careful not to fall behind, but I think we're doing good so far. I think it's been a good class so far. Any thoughts or questions before we shift into St. Augustine? All right, hearing none, I'm going to get this video queued up, but then I want to say a few just sort of introductory remarks about the confessions before we watch this video. Yeah, so here's my here's my little introductory remarks. I'm on Roman numeral 1. Introduction to the confessions, and y'all, here's the main thing that I want to say, and we've already talked a little bit in the class about how Augustine sort of marks in some ways the beginning of the medieval period. What does that word medieval mean? Does anyone know? It means between the ages, right? The word medieval is a modern term. It's a term invented by people who lived after the Middle Ages, and it means between the ages. Now, what are the two ages in which the Middle Ages is between? Well, it's the classical world of antiquity, right? The world of Plato and Aristotle, the world of Homer, the world of ancient Greece and Rome. But then on the other hand, it's the modern world, and that word modern is kind of funky. On the one hand, it can just mean contemporary. On the other hand, it does tend to mean kind of a demarcated epoch historically. But the people who coined the term medieval were essentially Renaissance type thinkers. They considered themselves to be modern. In a way, everyone always considers themselves to be modern. But medieval means between the two ages. And so in terms of that first age, what is the first age again?
Classical.
Who can tell me? Yep. Say it again.
The classical age of antiquity.
Yeah, the age of classical antiquity, Greece, Rome, stuff like that, ancient Greek thinkers. In terms of that first age, in a very rough and ready way, we can say that age ended with the fall of Rome. And earlier in the semester, someone, it may have been Michael, I don't quite remember, or I don't remember who it was, someone sort of threw out a date for the fall of the Roman Empire as 450, and that works for me. And so Augustine is roughly contemporary with that, with the fall of Rome. In fact, one of his great works, The City of God, which I have some up right here. One of his absolutely greatest works. I mean, I would say that with the Confessions, this is his greatest work. The City of God, Civitas Dei contra Paganos. This book was written as a response to the fall of the Roman Empire because pagan thinkers and thinkers that very much were listening to and sitting at the feet of Plotinus / Porphyry. We're going to mention Plotinus / Porphyry when we get to book 7 of the Confessions, book 7 being one of 3 books that we're focusing on in this class from the Confessions. We'll get into that more with book 7. But the pagans were looking at the Christians, because remember, Constantine converted several centuries before this time, but that was still regarded as a new development. And so the pagans were looking at the Christians and saying, it's your fault. You're the ones who let eternal Rome fall at the hands of the barbarians. And so Augustine is writing his book, City of God, against them. He's articulating a defense of Christianity. But the point right now is that it's the fall of the Roman Empire that ends the age of classical antiquity, and that's roughly the time that Augustine lived. So Augustine can sort of hit on both sides. He can be regarded as an ancient thinker. In fact, in Christian theology, he's often regarded as one of the church fathers, but then he's also regarded as the beginning of the medieval period, okay? So yeah, we talked a little bit about that already. Let me say a few words about the confessions themselves. And this, I'm going to keep this very brief, but at the macro level, the confessions as a whole, you can regard it or them, you can regard the work as sort of falling into two halves. And each half is a narrative. So books 1 through 9 are the narrative of Augustine's own life. Books 1 through 9 are Augustine's own autobiography. You might say his own spiritual autobiography that begin, as you know, they begin with his birth and even before his birth, right? You know that in book 1, he even talks about himself before he was born. So it begins with his birth, but then it ends this first part of the confessions, this first narrative, the autobiography of Augustine. It ends with book 9 and the death of his mother, as you can see right here. Okay. And so that's kind of like the first half of the confessions. And that's the narrative of his own life. But then the second half of the confessions, books 11 through 13, the second half of the confessions comprise the biography of the world, the narrative of the world, the story of the world. And as you can see on the outline here, that's obviously going to include and center on the creation of the world, the creation of the world. In fact, I cannot resist the temptation just to allude to the chapter of book 12 of the Confessions, the chapter of book 12. Can someone read me the title of book 12 of the Confessions?
Platonic and Christian Creation.
Right, Platonic and Christian Creation. Y'all remember how we've talked about how for the medievals, there's really two sources that they're drawing upon in very macro terms. There's the source of the ancient Greek legacy, but then there's the source of what I think of as Jewish or Hebrew thought. You remember that? And that's unlike Plato and Aristotle. Plato and Aristotle aren't relying on Jewish thought. They don't care about it, even if they know about it. But for Christian thinkers and Muslim thinkers, and obviously Jewish thinkers in the medieval period, there's really two different sources that they're drawing from. And you see both of those two sources in the title of book 12, Platonic and Christian Creation. Am I making sense? So Augustine cares deeply about what Plato says about creation, or what you might call cosmogony. I will put that term in the chat. Cosmogony. I think I spelled it up. Yep. Thank you. Autocorrect. Cosmogony. I'm actually not sure if that's spelled correctly, but this G-O-N root is connected to the word Genesis. So it means origin or beginning. And then what does cosmos mean? The world, right? So cosmogony means sort of like the origin of the world, the origin story of the world. And Augustine cares about Plato's cosmogony, his creation account, and the biblical creation account. Did it say biblical? Yeah, Christian creation, the biblical account of creation. Now, does it surprise anyone? So I think you all know that the Bible has an account of creation, right? Probably everyone knows that. But does it surprise anyone to hear that, like, Plato has an account of creation? Does that surprise anyone? Plato wrote a dialogue called the Timaeus. The Timaeus. And that is actually the only Platonic dialogue that the medievals would have had access to before the 12th century. You know how we've talked a lot about the rediscovery of Aristotle in the 12th century? We've talked a lot about that and how that shifted the definition of terms like philosophy and theology. Well, it wasn't just Aristotle, as I've alluded to. It was also Plato. Plato is also lost to the medieval, to Latin-speaking Christians like Augustine, like Anselm. We don't read any text by Anselm, but we'll reference him now and then. And someone is doing their paper on Anselm, which is great. But anyway, in the same way that Aristotle's rediscovered, so also Plato gets rediscovered. The only Platonic dialogue that was available before the rediscovery of the 12th century was the Timaeus. And the Timaeus is important precisely because in that dialogue, Plato develops a story of creation, okay? I'll tell you the main difference between, and it's really interesting, it's fascinating, in a lot of ways, the medievals who were Christians were able to read that story of the Timaeus and be like, oh yeah, that's real similar to what it talks about in the book of Genesis, for example. The main difference between the Timaeus on the one hand and the Christian understanding of creation on the other, the main difference has to do with the phrase ex nihilo. Ex nihilo. What does ex nihilo mean?
Oh, nothing.
Christians, as we've already talked about a little bit, think that God created all things out of nothing, or you might put it like this: God created all things not out of anything. So, by the way, did you see that I flipped it to a negation? A negation, kind of like Parmenides' negations in the spirit of negative theology. The doctrine of creation ex nihilo says that God created not out of anything. It's not the case that God created out of anything. That's a negation. Well, that negation is precisely what the Timaeus lacks. The Timaeus speaks of God as a craftsman or a demiurge. Y'all, a lot of these things that I put in the chat, it's not like I'm going to test you on them, but I assume that you're interested. By the way, that root erg here is related to ergon. It's related to energeia. We talked about energeia as Aristotle's understanding of full actuality or pure act. And we talked about how that word energeia means energy. Well, the word ergon in Greek means work. It's related to energeia. Has anyone ever heard of an ergonomic chair or an ergonomic pen? An ergonomic chair is one of those weird chairs that like you lean forward in. It's supposedly good for your posture, blah, blah, blah. Same thing with ergonomic pens. There's pens that supposedly make it easier to work. Okay. And so ergon is just the Greek word for work. And the demiurge is the one who works with, well, oversimplifying, works with prime matter and then shapes it and creates it into oceans and land and trees and animals. Are you with me? So notice so here's what I want you to pick up from this. And this is a massive digression, but it's interesting and it's important. So what I just said is that Plato is kind of like Aristotle. We've already talked about how Aristotle has this thing called prime matter. And remember, it's on the opposite end of the metaphysical spectrum from what?
Prime form or form.
Pure form or form. What are some other words for form? Here, can someone help out Jacob? How about this? God.
Yeah.
God. The Greek word is theos. And there's lots of names for God for Aristotle. He calls God the unmoved mover. He calls God the prime mover. He calls God thought thinking itself. Y'all, that is super important if you're going to write your paper on Thomas Aquinas. But see, on the one hand, on Aristotle's metaphysical spectrum, which, by the way, that's a thing that I made up. On one end of Aristotle's metaphysical spectrum, you have pure form, aka God. But then on the other end of Aristotle's metaphysical spectrum, you have what? Come on.
Prime matter.
Prime matter, exactly. And what I'm saying to you right now is that in the Timaeus, God does not create out of nothing. That's how it is in the Bible. At least that's what Christians think. No, God does not create out of nothing. God creates out of the word that Plato literally uses is stuff. I'm not going to go into that right now, but it's tantamount to prime matter. Are you with me? See, Plato and Aristotle really think the same things, like 90%. It's just that Plato wrote in these dialogue stories. Aristotle was the one who was systematic about it. Are you with me? But they both really thought they had very similar views, and they both believe in something that you could call prime matter. And here's the upshot. Neither of them would say that God created that prime matter out of nothing. No, they would not say that. They would both say, if you pressed them, that it's always existed. The world has always existed. There's never been a time when prime matter, there was never a time before prime matter. All right. So all that to say, book 12 is called Platonic and Christian Creation. And the reason I brought that up, there's two reasons I brought it up. Number one, because part 2 of the Confessions is Augustine's narrative of what? Part 2 of Augustine's Confessions is his narrative of what?
The world.
The world, exactly. And that has a lot to do with creation. That's the first reason I bring the title of book 12 to your attention, because it's about creation, aka the narrative of the world. But then secondly, the title of book 12 highlights the two sources that the medievals are drawing from. And what are those two sources?
The Hebrew Bible and Greek philosophy.
That's right. And I like the phrase Hebrew Bible. You could also, if you wanted, use other phrases. You could use the Old Testament, although that's an explicitly Christian term. You could also say the Hebrew legacy, stuff like that. But that's right, Mason. Okay, y'all. So the point right now, because I'm introducing the Confessions here on Roman numeral 1. The point right now is that the Confessions includes these two narratives. Part A is the narrative of Augustine's life, his autobiography. Part 2 is the narrative of creation. The first part is books 1 through 9. The second part is books 11 through 13. And that raises a question, does it not? What about book 10? Right? Now, this is what's fascinating, and this is what's going to lead us to the video that we're about to watch. Book 10 is about memory. Memory. If you were to make a list of the top 5 themes that Augustine, especially in the Confessions, is obsessed with, you'd have to talk about memory. Okay? So book 10 is on the memory, and look at what it says here on your screen. Concluding that at the heart of human memory, we find a vague recollection of the unbroken community between God and man in paradise. Now, y'all, does that make sense? What I'm trying to say here, and it's, I don't know. On the one hand, it's, look, what I'm trying to say here is that here's what Augustine thinks, I think. I think what he thinks is that deep down inside of us, we have a subconscious memory, and that word subconscious is important. We have this subconscious memory. We've all forgotten it, but maybe, just maybe, it might be possible to get back in touch with it. He thinks we have this subconscious memory of being with God. Being with God in, you might say paradise, you might say the Garden of Eden. Now, let me say this real quick. Now, okay, wait, does that make sense? Does that make sense what I'm trying to say to you? And y'all, I don't know how you feel about that. Like, let me say that this idea that all human beings have implanted in them this buried subconscious memory of union with God, being connected to God, that idea, first off, probably 3 or 4 years, I would have been very skeptical that Augustine actually thought that. I recently have become convinced that, holy shit, he does think that. Second thing I want to say is that it's very connected to mythology, okay? If Augustine is right, if Augustine's right that all human beings have a buried subconscious memory of being united to God, then that opens the door to looking at the myths of the world. I'm talking about myths like, you know, Hindu myths, Nordic myths, stuff like that. The Greek myths about Uranus and Gaia and Kronos and Zeus, like those myths, and many of those are cosmogonies, by the way. They're creation stories, many of them. If Augustine's right that human beings have this buried memory of being united with God in paradise, then one of the things that does is it opens the door for people who follow Augustine, and right now I'll just say Christians. It opens the door for Christian thinkers to be very open to myths, all myths. Now, let me hit the pause button and say, why might that be the case? Why would I say that? Why would I say that if Augustine's right with this claim, then it opens the door for followers of Augustine to be very embracing and welcoming of the myths of the human race? Why would I say that?
Because every culture, like it doesn't matter what culture you're a part of, you know, you have like some idea of the creation story.
Yeah. Is that you, Christian?
That was true.
Yes, that's Christian.
Yeah, I like it. Stuff like that. I mean, and what it does is it, you know, like, I don't know about you, but I kind of like grew up in the Southern Baptist Church in the Bible Belt. I mean, I'm kind of a recovering fundamentalist. And so there's this idea that Christians have to like say that all myths are evil. No, actually, Augustine didn't think that. The church fathers didn't think that. C.S. Lewis doesn't think that. Read his essay, Myth Become Fact. And also Pope Benedict XVI definitely did not think that. And that leads me just to the last thing that I want to say, and that is that so remember a minute ago, I said that 3 or 4 years, I would have been really skeptical that Augustine actually believed this. And I would have been really skeptical that actually it's a serious view. Or that anyone took it seriously. But what's changed my mind is that I've realized that there are serious and, quite honestly, very compelling traditions of modern thought, modern philosophy that agree with this, view, and therefore think that in the deep recesses of human memory, and when I say memory, I don't just mean individuals, I also mean cultures, okay? That in the deep recesses of the memory of human cultures, there is a memory of revelation. That is to say, of some kind of experience that human beings have had with the divine. There's modern thinkers who think this as well. For example, a German philosopher named Schelling, who I think is amazing. So anyway, yeah, I'm just trying to say that this is what Augustine thought, and I think it's an intriguing thought. And y'all, it has to do with memory. And I want to say one more brief thing before we watch this video of mine that I think is about 10 minutes, maybe. And that is, why is this stuff about memory important? It's partly because it's important because of Plato. And let me try to say this real quick. So here, a moment ago, I talked about all the ways that Plato and Aristotle agree, and that's true. They do agree like 85, 90% of the time. That's true. Here's one of the main ways in which they disagree, okay? Aristotle thinks that 100% of what you know, you learned through your sense perception, your eyes, your ears, vision, hearing, touch, etc. Aristotle thinks that 100% of what you know, you learned through your senses. Plato disagrees with that. Plato says, no. Actually, what it means to know something is to remember it. And the Greek word here is anamnesis. I'm not going to write that down. Another way to talk about it is the doctrine of recollection. This is what Plato thought. And in order to make sense of it, Plato basically had to embrace something like reincarnation. Are you with me? Like, does that make sense? Like, how in the world could David Newsom remember some primordial encounter with God in the Garden of Eden? How is that possible? Well, Plato has to say the only way it's possible is reincarnation or the transmigration of the soul. Okay. He talks about that, especially in the Phaedo. But look, is Augustine allowed to? So let me just say that Platonic view assumes or presupposes the immortality of the soul, That notion of reincarnation, aka the transmigration of the soul, it presupposes that our bodies might change, right? It's true that in the 21st century, I have a human body, but then it may be that in the 17th century, I had the body of a monkey or a grasshopper or an amoeba, right? Our bodies change, our bodies come and go, but what remains permanent? What remains constant throughout all of the changes of the body?
The soul.
The soul. So you see, in order for Plato's account to work, he has to affirm the doctrine of the immortality of the soul, which basically means that our souls have always existed. Are you with me? Now, let me ask you a question. Do you think that Augustine is allowed? Let me put it this way. Do you think that Augustine, let me put it this way. Does Augustine have any good reasons to reject that view, in your opinion? David, do you have something in mind?
Yeah, well, it would definitely be extra biblical.
One would think. And why is that, David?
Well, at least to my knowledge, I'm kind of recovering from my fundamentalism as well, but
Yeah.
to my knowledge, it's not in the Bible.
Well, now that's true. And just quick side note, it's always important in my view, what I'm finding important and what I've found important over the last couple of decades is that it's important not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Although I'm not trying to be your spiritual director, but let me just say that, look, we've already said that Christians think that the Bible teaches that God created the world out of nothing. which means that Christians think that the Bible teaches that there's really only two things. There's God and then his creation. Like, this is what I tell my daughters. That's what I taught my daughters when they were like 3 years old. There's only two things, God and creation. And the second thing, creation, has it always existed according to Christianity? No. See, so that implies that souls, human souls, have not existed from all eternity. They're not like God. Human souls were created in time. Are you with me? Now, quick side note, there actually are Christians who believe in the immortality of the soul. People like Origen. Also, there's other people. I don't have time to talk about it, but they are fascinating people. Some people think that Thomas Aquinas is really open to this view, but we don't have time to talk about that right now. Augustine says, no. The immortality of the soul is not an option. So he has to come up with an alternative way for human beings to recollect. He has to come up with an alternative way for human beings to remember this primordial experience. Look with me on the screen, this primordial experience of an experience of community or unity between God and man in paradise.
And actually, I had a question about that.
Go ahead.
To be honest, it might just be a word game. This doesn't work with the soul since those were made on day 6 or whatever.
Actually, in day 6, it doesn't say that God made the soul. It says that God made Adam.
Okay. Well, in that case, I was wondering if you could argue that creation is actually eternal. Because while it's true that God created creation, there was no time before then. So technically, like it's always existed, by one interpretation. One
could say that. And that's exactly what Origen says, David. Yeah, it's fascinating. And I think that actually the Orthodox Christian doctrine of creation ex nihilo honors that principle, because the Orthodox understanding of the doctrine of creation is at pains to clarify that what we're not talking about is simply some event that happened, 250 billion years ago or whatever. In other words, creation is still happening. It's always the case that creation is utterly dependent on God. That was the case. That's the case in the year 2021. It was the case in the year 1021. It was the case 100 million years ago, and it's always been the case. So yeah, that's right. Still, people like Augustine and Saint Bonaventure are very insistent that we have to say that there was a beginning of creation. And yet, when we get to book 11 of the Confessions, we're going to have to see that even for Augustine, that's problematic, even though he does affirm that we need to say that creation had a beginning, okay? But y'all, we're never going to get to book 11 of the Confessions unless we make progress. And that requires me to stop talking, and that requires us to watch this little video. It's 8.5 minutes long. And this is really about recollection, the importance of memory in the Confessions, okay? So I think one or two of you may have seen this, but we're going to watch this real quick, okay?
Hello, this is the first video I've made in a couple of years, I think. But I wanted to make a quick video about Mino's paradox and the presence that it has, the role that it plays in Augustine's Confessions. I'm doing this primarily for my dad because I want to be able to read the Confessions with him, to study it with him, and also maybe to teach it to him. But of course, he'll also have many things to teach me as well. So what I want to do just for the next few minutes is to explain how Mino's paradox is contained in St. Augustine's Confessions. So the first thing I need to do is explain what Mino's paradox is. And this is something that occurs in Plato's dialogue, the Mino, which is one of his early dialogues. And when I teach this to undergrads, what I typically say is that Mino's paradox is the paradox that you cannot search for something that you either completely don't know or something that you completely do know. In other words, let's say that I want to search for this cup. Strictly speaking, that's impossible because you can't look for something that is already totally within your grasp.
And actually, I can't hear the video right now.
I'm thinking about the cup. There's no way that I can look for the cup. So,
who said that?
I'm sorry, that was me. I think the volume went down, but maybe I think it might be good.
Awesome.
Something.
I don't know what happened. Thanks. Thank you.
It first needs to be something that to some extent you don't know or don't completely grasp. But on the other hand, if you have completely no idea,
I'm just going to back it up a couple seconds.
There's no way that I can look for the cup. So in order to look for something, it first needs to be something that to some extent you don't know or don't completely grasp. But on the other hand, if you have completely no idea concerning an object, if you completely and simply do not know the object, in that case also you're unable to search for it. After all, if I were to say, hey, I want you to go out and find a Yazzle-Cadoodle or a Kiliagon, you probably will not be able to look for that object because you have no idea what it is. So this is Mino's paradox that that Plato draws out for us and develops for us in that dialogue called the Mino. And whenever I teach this to undergrads, I often talk about Donald Rumsfeld, who I believe was George W. Bush's Secretary of Defense. Famously, whenever he was talking about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, he spoke of known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And he used this little schema to address the issue of whether we know that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Interestingly, Donald Rumsfeld forgot to mention the most riveting of the four possibilities, namely unknown knowns. In other words, Rumsfeld forgot to entertain the possibility that maybe there are things that we know, but we don't explicitly know that we know them. Things kind of like Freud's subconscious. These are things that are deep inside of us, possibly in the deep recesses of our memory, possibly things like trauma, things that are inside of us. It's just that we don't explicitly know that we know them. And that's why we need things like psychoanalysis and counseling in order to draw them out of us, which is exactly what happens, by the way, in Plato's dialogue, the Mino. What you have is Plato and the Mino who are engaging a slave boy and asking him a series of yes or no questions, which eventually gets the slave boy to state the Pythagorean theorem. And what's interesting is that Plato and Mino do not pump information into the slave boy. Rather, they simply draw it out of him. They draw out of him that which was already inside of him, namely this mathematical knowledge that can be used to deduce the Pythagorean theorem. By the way, that's what education is. Exducatio is to draw out, kind of like a duct draws water and transports it from point A to point B. An aqueduct does that. The point of exducatio, or education, is not to put information into the student, but rather to draw the information out of it, to summon that which the student already knows, to summon that knowledge out of the deep recesses of the student's memory. And that process is called anamnesis. And that happens with a midwife, which is why people like Plato and Kierkegaard often speak of midwives and that maieutic process of drawing things out of people. Okay, so that's Mino's paradox. Now let's turn to Augustine's Confessions. At the very beginning of the Confessions, Augustine basically alludes to Mino's paradox. This is in book 1. It's in the very first section of the very first section. It's in my version, which is Henry Chadwick, that I'm reading from an e-reader. It's the second paragraph. So I will read the second paragraph of Augustine's Confessions, book 1. Grant me.
Hey, y'all. You should like read along. Are you with me? Like you should read along in your copy of the Confessions. This is the second paragraph of the entire work. And we're going to read the first paragraph in just a moment, but you should follow along, okay?
Lord, to know and to understand. Which comes first, to call upon you or to praise you, and whether knowing you precedes calling upon you. But who calls upon you when he does not know you? For an ignorant person might call upon someone else instead of the right one. But surely you may be called upon in prayer that you may be known. Yet how shall they call upon him in whom they've not believed? Now there's already a lot going on there in those brief lines. But Augustine clearly has in view Mino's paradox. In other words, he's clearly saying, how can I know God? How can I search for God if it weren't for the fact that I already know something about God deep down inside of me? And we won't get into the Platonic notions of recollection in this video, but suffice to say that Augustine thinks that there is knowledge of God that is implanted in us from the deep recesses of our memory. And really the whole point of the Confessions, or at least one way of articulating the point of the Confessions, is that Augustine is rehearsing or remembering or putting together or narrating the story of his life in order to show how God was there from the beginning, and in order to show how his life is a process of God being drawn out of him, of him coming to know God more, to recognize the God that is already in him more and more, and to do that ongoingly. That's really what the Confessions is about. It's the narrative of Augustine's journey of remembering and coming more and more to know and to love the God that was already in him from the beginning. If God were not already in him from the beginning, in the deep recesses of his memory as an unknown known, then he wouldn't have been able to set out on a search for God in the first place. And that search for God is precisely what the Confessions is.
All right, y'all.
North America, call.
I hope that that made some sense. I hope that you could hear it. The Confessions is this paradoxical journey or pilgrimage, you could say pilgrimage, through which Augustine is coming to remember what's already in him. So he's looking for something that paradoxically he already has, except that he doesn't have it, right? What I'm saying is that God is an unknown known, kind of like an experience that you had, but maybe you've blocked it out. So for example, trauma is a great example, a great analogy. When people experience trauma, they forget certain things that was going on when the trauma took place, right? But through therapy, etc., that you can regain access to that. That's a great analogy for what Augustine's talking about. And the word education is precisely means to draw out of the self meaning and truth and beauty. All right. Real quick, I want to put in the chat, and we have 10 more minutes ish. But I want to put in the chat, education in Latin was educatio. So y'all see the X there in educatio? That X went away. We don't have time to talk about that, but a lot of times the X's from Latin words into English goes away. The X, so it really means, it's really exducation, right? And duke means to draw. So exducatio is to draw something out. And that's a very Platonic notion. That's what happens in Plato's dialogue, the Mino. I know that I used to make my students read the Mino. Mason, did you read the Mino in my class? I can't remember.
Yes, yeah, we did.
Okay. And I don't know if Greg Bach makes people read the Mino. I hope he does. Does he, by the way? Did anyone have Greg Bach for Intro to Philosophy? Okay, moving on. Augustine's God is an unknown known. He's searching for something that he has, and then, but yet at a different level, he doesn't have him. All right. So it's very paradoxical. It's very mysterious, and it's freaking awesome. All right, y'all. Let's see if we can talk about book one for a few minutes. And if we do nothing else, I want to read. What I'd like to do is read the first paragraph. Now, you already read the second paragraph. That's great. I want to read the first paragraph. I would love to read the last paragraph if we can, and maybe just list some bullet points from book one. It's probably unrealistic to think that we'll get through it in the next 10 minutes, but we can try. Could I get a volunteer to read the very first paragraph? This is on page 3, book 1, the early years. Could I get a volunteer to read that first paragraph?
I'll read it.
Great.
Okay. You are great, Lord, and highly to be praised. Great is your power, and your wisdom is immeasurable. Man, a little piece of your creation, desires to praise you, a human being bearing his morality with you, carrying with him the witness of his sins and the witness that you resist the proud. Nevertheless, to praise you is the desire of man, a little piece of your creation. You stir man to take pleasure in praising you, because you have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you.
Thank you, Mason. Now, y'all, I think I mentioned earlier in the semester that whenever I first read this when I was your age, like I think it was my sophomore year in college, like I couldn't make heads or tails of it. It just seemed like a blooming, buzzing confusion to me. I mean, yeah, I really didn't know what he was doing. But there's some things that already in this first paragraph we can talk about that will get you on the right track to figuring out what Augustine is doing in the Confessions. And the first thing is very simply that this is prayer. Like, who is the audience, right? Like, I think anytime you read a text or listen to someone talk, it's always helpful to say, who is the audience? Who is being addressed in this text? Who is Augustine addressing in this text?
God, right?
Yeah, it's God. This text is a prayer. Now, who said that they wanted to include Anselm in their project? Who was that?
That was me.
David Newsom. Okay. Yeah. So the prayer thing, I don't know exactly what you have in mind regarding Anselm, but like Anselm's proslogion is also a prayer, and many people think that's super important. But the Confessions is a prayer. He's talking to God. This is a spiritual exercise. I mean, look, this is really the first text the first sort of medieval text that we're reading in the course. But even if you think about some of the preliminary texts that we read Plato's Line, we read an excerpt from from Aristotle's Metaphysics, right? You may have also read, I can't remember if y'all read the texts about Heraclitus and Parmenides. Those were secondary sources. But think about Plato's line and Aristotle's Metaphysics. They were nothing like this. Now, I'm talking about sort of the genre. Now Plato does write in a dialogue form, so that maybe is kind of similar, because you could argue that Plato's telling a story here. That's true. I'm sorry, you could argue that Augustine is telling a story here. That's true, but it's still very different from Plato, but it's even more different from Aristotle. Aren't you glad that I made you read a little bit of Aristotle? Did you see how systematic that was, how rigorous that was? I'm not saying that this is not rigorous, but it's not systematic. This isn't a logical analysis that he's doing. He's meditating, he's praying. Yeah. Now, the second thing that I think you can already see in this paragraph, and it's huge, is that Augustine is I'm going to say I'm going to say that he's a theologian of desire. Now, I should immediately X out the word theologian, because as we've already seen, he describes himself as a philosopher. Remember, Augustine says, I'll put it in the chat again. Augustine says, verum philosophus amator Dei est. The true philosopher is the lover of God. Now, when we get to Thomas Aquinas, that's not how they think about the philosopher. What Thomas Aquinas means by the philosopher is, anyone remember?
God.
No, you said that last time.
Aristotle, I think.
That's right. Aristotle. And they don't think that Aristotle loves God. Now, Thomas Aquinas does not hate Aristotle. Bonaventure kind of hates him sometimes. Thomas Aquinas doesn't hate him, but no one thinks that he's a lover of God, and yet he's the philosopher. So I want you to see how the meaning of the terms philosophy and theology shifts once Aristotle is rediscovered in the 12th century. I'm going to say right now, just introducing the Confessions, we could call Augustine a theologian of desire, and yet just remember, he doesn't call himself a theologian. All right? I'm speaking loosely here just to get ideas across to you. He's a theologian of desire. He's a thinker of desire. Do you see how in this first paragraph he's talking about desire? He says, well, and let me just ask you, what does man, and I don't have time to be politically correct all the time. I do try to be politically correct some of the time, but I don't have time to do it all the time. So what does Augustine say that man desires? To praise God, to praise you, O Lord. Now, that might sound super crazy to you guys. If that sounds super crazy to you guys, then that's not surprising. I mean, it does sound super crazy to the ears of modern secular people. If anyone is interested in this, I would point you to C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is always talking about this, in particular, his little essay, The Weight of Glory. It's all about this. But Augustine thinks, see, modern people think that human beings desire sex. I mean, that's what Freud says. We desire sex, period, paragraph, over and out. Donald Trump may have wanted to be president, but really, according to Freud, he wanted sex. I mean, that's what modern people tend to think. Augustine doesn't think that. Augustine lived before Freud, And Augustine thinks that what the human being truly desires is to praise God. That might seem implausible to you, and if it does, it's okay. I don't think that it's actually all that implausible. But the point right now is that Augustine is a theologian of desire. This text is drenched with the language of the heart. In fact, he talks about the heart, doesn't he? What's the last clause in the paragraph that Mason read? Our heart is restless until it rests in you. Now, y'all have read an excerpt from Aristotle. Can you imagine Aristotle saying that? No. Aristotle doesn't talk about desire. Does that mean that Aristotle sucks? No, it doesn't mean that Aristotle sucks. It just means that Augustine is radically different. Okay. Look with me at number B, letter B on the outline. This is connected, very connected to what we just said. In 5.5, I assume that you know what I mean when I say 5.5. It's on Chadwick, page 5, ironically. We find this language of intoxication. He also speaks of face, the face of God. Of course, that's biblical language, the face of God. But that should also remind you of this point that in the Garden of Eden, we were with God, because the word face implies personal presence. Personal presence, okay? A face is not some impersonal surface, like, you know, the surface of this lid. No. A face is not like that. A face is personal. And so when Augustine talks about the face of God, he's talking about God's personal presence. The word countenance comes to mind. And this should remind you of Augustine's, this memory that he's trying to get in touch with about being with God in the Garden of Eden. It should also remind you of the beatific vision, which he and others think is sort of the end game of the Christian journey. Remember, the Confessions is a journey, aka a pilgrimage. Quick side note, when Aristotle writes the Metaphysics, he's not going on a journey. He's giving you the full system because he thinks it's already in his head from the beginning, right? So you could say that Aristotle's metaphysics is synchronic. That word, this is the last thing I have to make this the last thing I say today. But synchronic means with time. So when Aristotle writes the Metaphysics, it's a system. Now, it does take time for you to read it, and it does take time for him to write it, but he thinks it's all in his head. So it's a synchronic system. In other words, it doesn't unfold over time. The opposite of synchronic is diachronic. That word, that prefix dia, we've already talked about that. It means through, like a diaphragm is what that through which air moves in your body. The Confessions is diachronic. What does that mean? It means that it unfolds through time. It's a journey. Augustine is going on a journey. And so the journey, what is the journey? What is the origin of the journey, and what is the destination of the journey? Well, you could say that the origin of the journey is God's presence in the Garden of Eden. And you could say that the destination of the journey is God's presence in the beatific vision. But you see, the word face talks about both of those. And this will be the last thing I say. If that's true, then you could say that this journey of Augustine is, it originates with God, but then it ends up with God. In other words, the destination is the origin. The origin is the destination. He begins with God, and then he ends with God. In other words, it's a pattern of exit and return. Exit and return. We'll talk more about that next time. I'd say we got about halfway through book one. It could be worse. Y'all, good being with you today. Does anyone have a burning desire to speak? If you do, it's fine. We've covered a lot today. It's kind of turbulent, but we're trying to delve and to dive into the confessions. Any thoughts, questions?
Is there a reason why he repeats himself all the time? And sorry, Mirka.
Hey, Jacob Dunn, hold that thought. I'll come back to it. Mirka, what did you want to say?
You're fine, Jacob. And I had a question about the presentation for Wednesday.
Great.
You would like in a PowerPoint, because I know we have to talk about a paragraph and do our explanation on it. So is that what you wanted?
You can do PowerPoint if you want. It's totally up to you. It really is totally up to you.
And
I do not require a PowerPoint, but it would not hurt your grade. I mean, it's totally up to you. Okay. And Mirka, you're right that I ask you to identify, or I encourage you in your paper to identify a passage. That's true. And therefore it makes sense for you to talk about that in your presentation. That's true. And yeah, what else were you going to say, Mirka?
And like the essay, do we turn it in, like, do I turn it in Wednesday or when?
No way. The essay is not due until much later.
Okay, just making sure.
Yeah. Y'all, is everyone clear on that? All of this is in the syllabus and in the little essay guide. I don't remember what the due date is. Oh, there's the thingy. Oh, it's not on there. I don't remember what the due date is for the essay, Mirka, but it's not for, at least 2 or 3 or 4 more weeks. And that's only for people writing on Augustine. Y'all, I'll put out an announcement about that, or an announcement about that in case anyone has any more questions. But Mirka, does that answer your question?
Yes, that answer is good.
Thank you so much. Jacob, talk to me.
All right. I kind of felt when reading the 3 books that we had to read for the confessions that he did a lot of repeating himself a lot.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. I've never thought about that. I don't really, I've never thought about that, and I don't have a whole lot to say about it, but I think it makes sense given everything we've talked about today. I mean, it makes sense with respect to memory. I mean, repetition can be a mnemonic device. Repetition can also be a way of trying to go deeper, ruminating on something. You know what I mean? So I think it makes sense from that perspective, but it also makes sense in terms of being on a journey. I mean, sometimes when you're on a journey, there's things that repeat. I mean, if I drive from here to Washington, D.C., I'm going to drive through several cities. That's a form of repetition. Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah. So, and it also makes sense when you think about how the confessions is diachronic, unfolding through time. Repetition takes time. In a really rigorous logic textbook, like the one I have in my bookshelf over here, or in a really rigorous geometry textbook, theoretically, there's no repetition because it's just a system. In a system, things don't need to be repeated. Like in a computer program, things aren't, no one needs to be reminded of something in a computer program. All right. Y'all, thank you very much. Keep reading, keep sitting with the confessions, and we will continue next time. Hopefully we will get through all 3 of these books. We shall see. Peace to you. I'll upload this lecture as always onto my YouTube channel. Okay. Y'all take care.